The period from 1981 through 1995 was like living through a war with unthinkable casualties and no end in sight. Something was wrong in the universe. I felt it strongly in my guts. It cropped up in dreams before I knew what was to come. And then the avalanche hit. Part 1. The AIDS crisis. In 1985, LGBT activist Cleve Jones came up with a concept for what would become the largest piece of communal folk art in the world. His concept was a quilt that would be made to commemorate those who had died of AIDS-related causes. And today we know it as the AIDS Memorial Quilt. Particularly in a time when many wouldn't get a proper funeral due to the stigma of the disease, the quilt would serve as a memorial and a reminder of the scale of the loss. Each panel is dedicated to a single person and measures 6 by 3 feet, the size of a typical grave. It is currently 1.3 million square feet in size. But far from being a traditional solemn death shroud, the quilt panels are often filled with creativity and art and memory. There are references to Disney scattered across the quilt, from Mouseketeer hats to iconic animated characters, each a meaningful image to a loved one who has passed. And amongst them, there are 10 panels that bear the name Howard Ashman. The AIDS crisis or epidemic of the 80s and 90s was a period mired in misinformation, homophobia, and fear that still affects HIV-positive people even today. Its effect on the queer community really cannot be overstated. This era of tragedy was happening at the same time as something called the Disney Renaissance, a period of time when Disney animation went from a kind of creative and financial slump to this massive critical boom. Films from this period include what many consider to be the best ever released by the company, including Aladdin, The Lion King, Mulan, The Little Mermaid, Hercules, and, crucially for this video, Beauty and the Beast. All through the research and scripting for this video, it kept hitting me this kind of cruel irony of both these periods existing simultaneously. This period of intense creative joy and success, and this period of horrendous suffering and death, and how at the centre of both, experiencing the extremes of both at the exact same time, was one extraordinary man, Howard Ashman. Part 2. Howard Ashman and Disney. At the end of Beauty and the Beast, there's this short dedication to a man who died just before the film's release, and it reads, "To our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul, we will be forever grateful. Howard Ashman, 1950 to 1991. I imagine a lot of you haven't heard Howard Ashman's name before, but you are absolutely familiar with his work. Little Shop of Horrors, Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast that he was writing lyrics for as he was dying. There is this absolutely gut-wrenching scene in the 2009 documentary Waking Sleeping Beauty that focuses on the Disney Renaissance as a whole, talking about the Beauty and the Beast press screening. This screening had gone incredibly well, better than anyone had even anticipated or expected. And the creative team who were there at the screening, including Alan Menken, rushed across town to tell Howard Ashman about it. And they described this moment from like the joy of them being in the car and talking about how well it had gone to stepping into the hospital where their friend had been robbed of his senses, he had gone blind from his illness, and there was this understanding that he may never see the finished film. To my mind, Ashman's impact on Disney's success both in the Renaissance era and today is profound. Interviews with his collaborators and footage of him at the time showed what a huge impact he had in terms of his ideas and passion, even at his short time at the studio. Like, let's be clear, his lyrics are stunning, but it wasn't just lyrics that he brought. He essentially shaped the way in which music and animation worked together, using his background in Broadway to essentially create a new art form. He had input in character design, including backing the famous drag queen Divine as the model for Ursula in The Little Mermaid. And there's footage of him in the recording booth of the actors from Beauty and the Beast, essentially acting as a kind of creative director. In an interview, Roy Disney once referred to him as another Walt. And the director of the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast, Bill Condon, has explained of the animated movie. It was Ashman's idea, not only to make it into a musical, but also to make Beast one of the 2 central characters. Until then, it had mostly been Belle's story that they had been telling. Within just his first 2 movies at the studio, The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, he was already having an incredible impact and his talent was undeniable. So I first heard about Howard Ashman when I watched that 2009 documentary, Waking Sleeping Beauty. But interestingly, Disney Plus has actually put out a documentary about Ashman, simply entitled Howard, a couple of months ago. And in that documentary, they talk a little bit about something called the I Want song. So this is something that I've seen Alan Menken, his writing partner, talk about very briefly, and especially, you know, Ashman's impact on it. But essentially, like, if you've ever listened to a Disney soundtrack or a musical soundtrack, you'll be familiar with the concept of the I Want song. It is that moment at the beginning of the story where the protagonist, the main character, will like sit down or pace around or look out into the audience and talk about what it is that they want, what they are driving towards, what internally is motivating them. And it's this moment of real connection between the audience and that character. It's a longing cry into the universe by a life filled with potential, whether it's part of your world from The Little Mermaid, or reflection from Mulan, or one jump reprise from Aladdin, or How Far I'll Go from Moana. This quintessential cornerstone of some of the most iconic moments in animated film history are because of Howard Ashman. Because of his background in Broadway, this seemed like it would make perfect sense to him within Disney movies. But this was not an easy task for him to persuade people of. He had to really fight to have these kind of songs within the musical he was working on. The Little Mermaid, Part of Your World, came very close to being scrapped and cut from the musical entirely because the people around him couldn't see the value of having this kind of song that gave you a quiet moment to understand the character better. While I was scripting this video, I actually made a Spotify playlist of a bunch of I Want songs that I found in different Disney movies, which I've left in the description, which I can highly recommend as a very cathartic half hour of just listening to amazing songs and thinking about Ashman's legacy. Ashman wasn't a mermaid or a girl in rural France, but you can see his understanding of wanting freedom and acceptance, or feeling out of place in a seemingly homogenous society that judges the lead character for being different in his work. Queer fans, I think, often have this kind of interesting relationship with Disney that is often built around metaphorical or subtextual readings of characters and feeling some kind of connection to them, even when we know that we won't necessarily see explicit representation of ourselves on screen. For heterosexual and cisgender people, the concept of the happily ever after is something that they see readily on screen, oftentimes helped by Disney movies. It's something they learn and arguably take for granted through their childhoods. And I think a reason why a lot of queer Disney fans continue to feel this connection to the films into their adulthood is because they are still defining what the concept of a happy ending can look like for them in their own lives. Even though Disney, for the most part, doesn't really have canonical queer characters, especially not in its animated features, it still often focuses on outsider characters. And I think a lot of queer people can see themselves in that, sometimes in the heroes, but also sometimes in the villains. Now, this lack of queer representation in Disney, and in fact all children's media, is something I have talked about many times on this channel, but essentially it is rooted in this really insidious idea of the sexualization of LGBTQ+ people. There's still this idea that a lot of people have that queer characters in children's media are like inherently dangerous or harmful. And this concept of queer relationships being inherently adult or inappropriate is something that is like based on decades, centuries of misinformation, an erasing of our history, of a lack of education, of religious dogma, that make it so that some people are like actively opposed to this and other people just have like a sense that it's wrong, a sense that it's inappropriate, that they don't necessarily know where it comes from. Queer relationships are not any more adult or sexual inappropriate as straight ones, but they're often perceived that way, and the AIDS crisis, the AIDS epidemic, is actually a big part of that. It really was a period of fueling this kind of prejudiced fire. It was referred to at the beginning of the epidemic as GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, or the gay plague. The stigma around HIV and AIDS only contributed to an existing idea of gay people as, you know, inherently unnatural undesirables whose very touch might corrupt. Peter Snyder, an ex-president of Walt Disney Animation, has talked about a conversation he had with Ashman prior to his death. Howard said to me, "I didn't want to tell you about my HIV status because I didn't know how Disney would react. Here I am, a gay man, and I'm working on this movie for kids, and I didn't want to be fired." And this wasn't an exaggerated fear by Ashman. It was only actually earlier this year in the US that the Supreme Court upheld federal protections for LGBT employees. Even though we know about Ashman's fear and hesitance to talk about his sexuality and positive status, especially in the context of his work at Disney, the question for a lot of people remains, how far did his sexuality and his positive status affect his work at Disney? Part 3. Beauty and the Beast, an AIDS allegory. To be honest, you don't really have to work that hard to see the ways in which Beauty and the Beast, which was the last musical that Ashman wrote the full lyrics for, can be seen as an AIDS allegory. The pop culture critic Anthony Oliveira actually recently summed up in a tweet a lot of the main elements that we can see behind this reading. He talks about how the film can be seen to be about loneliness of illness, about difficulty and need for patience, about how caretakers become consumed in service, about knowing somewhere, no matter what, a clock is ticking. The piece can easily be read as a symbolic portrayal of someone whose positive status has ostracized them from society, someone suffering from a curse that they believe inevitably will kill them. Angry and scared, the beast's outbursts actually match those of Ashman himself, that colleagues described as increasingly frustrated and irritable as the filming of the movie continued. It was interesting to note there are a number of conflicting opinions of those around Ashman as to whether Beauty and the Beast was a deliberate metaphor, whether it was a kind of subconscious or accidental metaphor, whether it had absolutely no link to metaphor whatsoever. Probably the most opposed to the AIDS allegory reading is a blog post recently on the Howard Ashman website by his sister that says, in no uncertain terms, there has been much talk lately of Howard having written Beauty and the Beast as a metaphor for AIDS. This is just plain not true. Howard wasn't writing an allegory for his illness. Kill the Beast was about a moment in a movie, not about seeing himself or anyone else outside the film as an outcast. His co-writer Alan Menken, on the other hand, is much more open to seeing what queer watchers of the movie have sensed within the subtext. The parallels that people see, and I see them, God, they're remarkable to see, but I don't think Ashman did it consciously. It just wasn't like him. He was so all about the musical and the storyline and serving the characters and serving the story arc, and that was it. But boy, the subtext is there, clearly. Other people are much more convinced by the idea. Director Condon stating in an interview, specifically for him, it was a metaphor for AIDS. He was cursed, and this curse had brought sorrow on those who had loved him, and maybe there was a chance for a miracle, and a way for the curse to be lifted. It was a very concrete thing that he was doing. Some reviews of the documentary Howard have criticised the ways in which the interviews that were chosen really downplay the impact that his sexuality and his status had on his art. At one point during the documentary, producer Peter Snyder actually says, "I think that was the genius of Howard. He was not political." But ironically, I think that whatever the reason is for it, the way that Ashman brings in the voice of the ostracised or the outsider is one of the things that resonates with queer Disney fans even today. We know he was worried about how the truth about who he was and what he was going through might get him fired. Is it beyond the realm of possibility he created this legacy through the Beast that he didn't tell those around him about? The fact is, we don't know how deliberate any AIDS allegory within Beauty and the Beast might be, because Howard Ashman died before the film was ever released, and before any of us could ask him. However, I do think an audience's independent reading of a piece of art is just as important as what the author originally put into it. Now, I'm not a musician or any kind of musical analyst, and so for this little section here, I'm going to pass over to Jake from the YouTube channel Dream Sounds, who has done a really amazing analysis of the Mob song from Beauty and the Beast, as well as an explicitly HIV/AIDS related song that Ashman himself wrote. Part 4, the Mob song.
At its core, the mob song is possibly the most concentrated form of the movie's main theme, the role of outsiders in society. The Beast is not only viewed as an outsider by the society, but his very existence is viewed as a threat to the stability of the society. Though Belle is portrayed as an outsider, the conflict of her being an outsider mainly comes from her own internal turmoil. This juxtaposition of both the Beast and Belle as different types of outsiders was deliberate. When Howard Ashman was originally brought into the Beauty and the Beast project, he reportedly had an influence on the Beast becoming the second main character of the story. So when we see Gaston tell the villagers that the Beast will take their children and the only retort is to kill him, it's difficult to not think about the ways in which that can be read as an AIDS crisis allegory. The intensity of the mob and also the religious imagery sprinkled throughout the song can be read as an allegory for something that many LGBTQ people experienced during the AIDS crisis. A vehemently queerphobic and also religious slant of people that use their beliefs as a reason to deny queer people proper health care. We don't like what we don't understand. In fact, it scares us, and this monster is mysterious, at least. Whether or not the AIDS crisis allegory was intentional is debated, but there is a lot of evidence that suggests it. Collaborators of Howard Ashman, such as Don Hahn and Alan Menken, have commented on how the work Howard made, especially towards the end of his life, did share a lot of commonalities with things he was experiencing at the time. In particular, the mob song was commented on by Howard's partner Bill Lauk in the recently released Howard Disney Plus documentary. To me, the mob song in Beauty and the Beast is trying to just imbue some point of view through a very subtle way. And he didn't want to make political theater, but I think he wanted to present characters that cast some kind of light on certain topics. In the Howard documentary, Don Hahn also referenced the song as being a direct parallel for the mob mentality that perpetuated queerphobia during the AIDS crisis. In terms of songs from Beauty and the Beast, perhaps none addressed the AIDS crisis metaphor as head-on as the mob song does. But like a lot of Ashman's work, the sort of relationship from the song to his life is shrouded in metaphors, and ultimately the references to things he was experiencing at the time are only really known by those who were close to him. So what would a very direct Howard Ashman song about the AIDS crisis sound like? Well, we don't have to really imagine what that would be like, because Howard Ashman did write a song with Alan Menken about the AIDS crisis, albeit not really for a show or a movie. Called Sheridan Square, the song depicts Ashman's experience as a gay man living in New York during the AIDS crisis, and how that affected his relationship to the city's gay community. Some of the boys have panic, but none of the boys leave town. They say we're on the good ship Titanic. We're gonna sing till the boat goes down. I think what makes Sheridan Square and the mob song so interesting is that both songs portray different sides of something that many LGBTQ people experienced during the AIDS crisis. A feeling of being completely othered by society. In Beauty and the Beast, the narrative tension highlighted in the mob song is mostly resolved at the end of the movie with the transformation of the Beast, with the movie's overall trajectory mainly being about assimilating him back into society. In contrast, Sheridan Square shows a more insular version of queer solidarity, with the focus mainly being on those directly affected by the AIDS crisis and what that means for the community as a whole. In other words, when faced with tragedy, do you look inward or outward?
Part 5. Disney the Company. This inward-outward question to me is really interesting when we look at Disney as a whole. It's not just a company that makes animated features, it has other kinds of programming, merchandise, theme parks, and employs a ton of people. And Disney itself over the years has become known as a specifically LGBT-friendly place to work. In 2019, the company earned a perfect score of 100 on the Corporate Equality Index, a national benchmarking survey administered by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. And this isn't just a recent phenomenon. Disney has actually had that top score for the last 13 consecutive years, and it also offered health benefits to LGBT partners of employees way back in the 1990s, 1995, which at the time was met with a ton of backlash, including legal backlash. And the Lesbian and Gay United Employees, or League within Disney, was actually the first LGBT employee organisation within a Hollywood studio. And yet, with all this seeming support internally, there's this kind of external ambivalence when it comes to their media or public image. Since 1990, there have been annual gay days at Disney, but it wasn't until last year at Disneyland Paris that the park itself actually acknowledged and got involved within that with their Magical Pride Parade, which kind of weirdly, because of Disney's lack of representation in their actual films and within the parks, meant that there was this kind of parade of straight characters for the event, which just strikes me as very strange. In a really interesting article on the website Them, which kind of explores anecdotally the reasons why so many queer people are fans of Disney, they quote this guy in his 50s, Worthy Meacham, who had been a Disneyland pass holder since the 80s, who said, "As a young gay man, it was hard to find a place where I felt safe. I could go to Disneyland and I knew I wouldn't be harassed for being gay. If I was, I could go to security and they would do something about it. You just don't find that level of safety or security in other places in Southern California." In a lot of ways, it feels like the workers of Disney, the individuals, a lot of them who will be queer fans of Disney themselves, are what created that kind of safe space, rather than necessarily the company itself as some kind of overarching power. A company who incidentally has long been criticised for underpaying those very staff.
Since the beginning, Disney has always been aligned with quote-unquote traditional US American values. I mean, Walt Disney himself was a patriot, and he sported a particular brand of conservatism that continues to influence both the company's public image and the stories they tell to this day. To see Disney only recently start to embrace the LGBTQ community after having a long and complicated relationship with LGBTQ people feels disheartening, to say the least. I think it's interesting to talk about the ways in which Disney has interacted with the LGBTQ community throughout the years, but I think it's even more interesting to talk about the ways in which LGBTQ people have carved out spaces for themselves within the Disney catalog. Because ultimately, LGBTQ people have a very particular relationship to Disney. Many people are put in front of TVs as children and told to empathize with these movies that may not necessarily empathize with them. When you have a lot of queer people growing up and understanding themselves, this kind of creates a unique relationship where they learn to express themselves through characters that they encounter in Disney movies. I think this is also similar to many ways in which LGBTQ people interact with societies and cultures that don't necessarily accommodate for them. Because there isn't really a space for you, you kind of have to make that for yourself. As LGBTQ people, it's also important to dissect how much of you results from how you were raised and if there are things you want to change moving forward. This type of self-discovery can be uniquely queer, and I think Disney's complicated relationship to the LGBTQ community also fits within that.
There have, over the years, been people who, in my opinion at least, have given Disney a bit too much credit. In 2014, for example, there was this article in The Atlantic that talked about kind of the phenomenon of people claiming that Disney was going to make Elsa gay, incidentally something that hasn't happened even after a sequel. And it kind of seemed to imply that the way in which queer people can read the subtext of Disney movies to see their own experiences reflected back at them somehow like inherently makes Disney a progressive company or like responsible for that, which I do not give them that credit. The piece suggests by preaching acceptance and questioning gender, the company's kids' films offer a queer studies crash course, which honestly to me just feels slightly ridiculous to suggest. Like the girl power elements of especially the Renaissance era movies, like Mulan's kind of dual gender presentation, for example, which a lot of LGBT people have seen themselves in, is not because Disney wanted to tell the story of like a transgender person in historical China. It's because we have projected ourselves and our journeys and our experiences onto that. In fact, any like specific empowering message that Disney was trying to put into Mulan is much more likely to have been like explicitly for cis and straight girls to show them ways in which they can break out of the patriarchal structure and idea of what they needed to be in terms of being like inherently feminine. Queer people who see elements of themselves in these stories are undergoing an exercise in self-empathy that draws a lot of us to these narratives that have wide-reaching lessons of self-acceptance without ever specifying that being gay or trans is something that can be acceptable. In fact, in the original Beauty and the Beast, Cogsworth was played by a gay man, David Ogden Stiers, who has said this about his role. It's a matter of economics. Cogsworth, the character I did on Beauty and the Beast, could be a bit flamboyant on screen because basically he's a cartoon, but they didn't want Cogsworth to become Disney's gay character because it got around a gay man was playing him. Part 6. Conclusion. I think a lot about the wholesome and long-lasting brand and experience of Disney, of it being something for the whole family, as something that links old and young alike together. And it just seems so unfair that at the centre of the Disney Renaissance, contributing to this mainstream family-oriented company's renewed success, was this man that was part of a whole community about to be wiped out. A community that still struggles today because of that very tragedy, that very epidemic, to create a sense of community between its elders and its youth that the kind of Disney brand takes so for granted, and a community that still hasn't been given a chance to be the lead character in one of these happily ever after movies that Disney itself produces. For me, this is the story of an individual tragedy, of a particular man and his particular life and death, but it's also the story of a more collective sense of loss. When we look at the beauty and art and compassion and family that was created by this generation of queer people, even as they were being treated so appallingly, the question that I kept coming back to while writing this video was like, what might they have gifted us if they had lived? What might it have been like to see their genius at a time when they could openly talk about themselves and their lives and their thoughts and wants and hopes and dreams? When they felt able to talk about the queer experience as more than just a metaphor. I have never cried before while working on a video for this channel. And I cried multiple times while researching and scripting this video. And when just the scale and sense of the loss of this period of time was like too overwhelming to think about, I would just come back to thinking about Howard, just one man who came to do this job after a period of failure elsewhere in his life, who had such a profound impact in such a short amount of time, who shaped the childhoods of so many people my age growing up, who had so much more to give. And I can't think about all of the potential of all of the people lost because it is too much. But I can think about the question, and I do think about the question, like, what stories might we have had with Howard at the helm, truly at the helm, as he clearly had the talent to be? That's kind of the point, isn't it? That we will never know. I really hope you found that video interesting. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Jake from Dream Sounds for his input on the video.
Editing Rowan here. I totally forgot to get footage of a very important piece of information, which is that this collaboration with Dream Sounds is actually like a two-way collaboration. So there is a video up already on their channel about Disney and drag culture, which I've contributed to. So go and check that out. The link will be in the description. It is a lot more cheery and fun than this video ended up being.
As well as to all my patrons who help me make videos like this. I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description if you are interested in helping to support me and the work I do on this channel. This obviously was a very specific moment in the history of the AIDS crisis and the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. If that is something that you are interested in finding out more about, if you don't know much about it, I'll leave a couple of recommendations of pretty staple documentaries that might help you to kind of find out a little bit more about the subject on a basic level. I'm also going to leave a link to the AIDS Quilt website where you can actually look at every individual panel that has been digitally photographed and is all there for you to see. I really recommend just going through and looking at a few panels, a few individuals, and just taking a moment to think about them and those who are lost. And as I mentioned before, I've also left that Spotify playlist of the I Want songs from Disney, and I think I'm going to go and listen to that now and just have a little cry.